Dan Kenner took another sip of bourbon and picked up his iPad. He had received a text from his wife, Jake, telling him she would be working late again and that he should go to dinner on his own. Dan liked having a plan. Since he had a night to himself, Dan's plan was to have a cheeseburger at Whataburger and spend the evening with Lee Child's latest Jack Reacher novel and a bottle of 13-year-old Malam and green bourbon that his father-in-law had given him. He had been saving the bottle for the right moment, and tonight promised to be that moment. Dan took another sip of bourbon and set the iPad down on the side table as he savored the 111-proof amber liquid and reflected on his current situation. Jake, Dan's wife of 6 years, had been working a lot of overtime for the past 6 months. Early in their marriage, they agreed to pay an equal amount each month into their joint checking account to pay bills and fund vacations. But their personal savings, checking, and retirement accounts were kept completely separate, and neither had access to the other's accounts. As a salaried employee, Jake's income did not increase for additional hours, so whether Jake worked 40 hours a week or 60, her income remained the same. With separate personal accounts, Dan didn't know whether Jake earned too much or too little from her overtime. The amount they each contributed to their joint account was far more than necessary for expenses, and the balance had grown considerably. This separation of accounts was something Jake had insisted on before they were married. Dan's business was struggling due to the general economic downturn when he and Jake met, and there were weeks and months when Dan refused to pay himself. That's the thing about owning a business. The garbage man gets paid before you do. Dan refused to lay off any employees and dipped more and more into his personal savings to keep the promise he had made to himself that no one would lose their job. It was one step after another, trudging through life, and when he closed his stores at nightfall, all he found was himself getting older and deeper in debt by the day. Jake made a decent salary as a staff accountant for a Fortune 500 company and stayed out of Dan's business. She feared the company's bankruptcy and stayed away from it. Dan had lived on savings during those lean years so as not to burden Jake, and although he sometimes struggled to meet his obligations to fund their joint account, he was always able to put his share into the account, knowing that the storm would eventually pass. Dan was able to not only weather the storm, but thrive. The collection of 3 auto repair shops he had inherited from his father had grown into a small chain of 12 stores in the last 2 years. In the next 3 years, he had acquired land that would allow him to expand the chain to 20 shops. All the stores were in the red, but Dan had deliberately kept his salary as low as possible and reinvested the profits in the business. All the stores had acquired tire equipment capable of mounting and balancing any size tire on any type of wheel, no matter how exotic. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment enabled their technicians to diagnose and repair the most complex issues. Dan had built a reputation for quality and reliability, attracting a loyal customer base that appreciated the honesty and expertise of his team. He had also invested in training programs for his employees, ensuring they were up to date with the latest automotive technologies and techniques. As Dan took another sip of bourbon, he reflected on how far he had come. He remembered the sleepless nights and the endless hours of hard work. He remembered the sacrifices he had made and the times he had doubted himself. But he had persevered, and now he was on the verge of something great. The expansion of his business was a testament to his determination and resilience. He had turned a struggling business into a thriving enterprise, and he had done it on his own terms. Jake's overtime had been a point of contention between them. Dan couldn't help but wonder why she was working so much when her income didn't change. He trusted her, but the separation of their finances and her long hours at the office had created a distance between them. He missed the closeness they once shared, the late-night conversations and the spontaneous adventures. He hoped that once his business was on more stable footing, they could reconnect and rediscover the joy they once had. For now, Dan decided to focus on the present. He picked up his iPad again, opened the Jack Reacher novel, and took another sip of bourbon. The smooth, smoky flavor of the bourbon and the gripping story in his hands provided a welcome distraction from his worries. As he settled into his chair, he felt a sense of contentment. He had come a long way, and despite the challenges, he was proud of what he had achieved. He was determined to keep pushing forward, to keep building his business, and to keep fighting for the life he wanted. Dan Kenner took a sip of bourbon and picked up his iPad. He had received a text from his wife, Jake, telling him she would be working late again and that he should go to dinner on his own. Dan liked a plan, and since he had a night to himself, his plan was to savor a cheeseburger at Whataburger, then spend the evening immersed in Lee Child's latest Jack Reacher novel, accompanied by a bottle of 13-year-old Malam and green bourbon that his father-in-law had given him. He had been saving the bottle for the right moment, and tonight promised to be that moment. Dan took another sip of bourbon, relishing the warmth of the 111-proof amber liquid as it slid down his throat, and set the iPad down on the side table. He reflected on his current situation. Jake, Dan's wife of 6 years, had been working a lot of overtime for the past 6 months. Early in their marriage, they agreed to pay an equal amount each month into their joint checking account to cover bills and fund vacations. But their personal savings, checking, and retirement accounts were kept completely separate, with neither having access to the other's accounts. As a salaried employee, Jake's income did not increase with additional hours. So whether Jake worked 40 hours a week or 60, her income remained the same. With separate personal accounts, Dan didn't know whether Jake earned too much or too little from her overtime. The amount they each contributed to their joint account was far more than necessary for expenses, and the balance had grown considerably. This separation of accounts was something Jake had insisted on before they were married. Dan's business had been struggling due to the general economic downturn when he and Jake met, and there were weeks and months when Dan couldn't pay himself. That's the thing about owning a business. The garbage man gets paid before you do. Dan refused to lay off any employees, dipping more and more into his personal savings to keep his promise that no one would lose their job. It was one step after another, trudging through life, and when he closed his stores at nightfall, all he found was himself getting older and deeper in debt by the day. Jake made a decent salary as a staff accountant for a Fortune 500 company and stayed out of Dan's business, fearing its potential bankruptcy. Dan lived on savings during those lean years so as not to burden Jake. Although he sometimes struggled to meet his obligations to fund their joint account, he was always able to contribute his share, knowing the storm would eventually pass. Dan was not only able to weather the storm, but thrive. The collection of 3 auto repair shops he had inherited from his father had grown into a small chain of 12 stores in the last 2 years. In the next 3 years, he had acquired land that would allow him to expand the chain to 20 shops. All the stores were in the red, but Dan had deliberately kept his salary as low as possible and reinvested the profits into the business. All the stores had acquired tire equipment capable of mounting and balancing any size tire on any type of wheel, no matter how exotic. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment enabled their technicians to diagnose and repair drivability problems on almost every vehicle manufactured in North America, Asia, and Europe, except in France, because screw Peugeots. So Dan's business was thriving, and Jake's job was going well. This should have been the happiest time of their lives, but cracks were appearing in their marriage. This was the second marriage for both Dan and Jake. Dan's first wife had been killed by an elderly driver while out for an early morning run. It was a clear, sunny morning with a bit of an October chill in the air. Because of the morning glow, the octogenarian driving to her doctor did not see Lizzie running down the street. The city was repairing a damaged culvert and had torn up the sidewalk, forcing Lizzie to run down the street about 20 feet. It didn't take much more. 20 freaking feet. 5 seconds of footage and 2 lives snuffed out. Lizzie didn't know it yet, but she was 4 weeks pregnant when the car hit her. It was the second time tragedy had struck the Kenner home. Dan's mother had died of lung cancer when he was in high school. He had never smoked a cigarette in his life when he developed a persistent cough for which she sought treatment. 8 weeks after the diagnosis, she had passed away. It took Dan months to recover from Lizzie's death. His father installed an interim manager at the store Dan ran, giving Dan time to mourn his wife and the child he would never have. Dan might never have recovered had his father not suffered a fatal heart attack while driving home from his office store one afternoon. This forced Dan to put aside his grief and focus on the business. People depended on him for a living. It was due to a careless accident that Dan met Jake. An apprentice mechanic had removed the radiator cap without waiting for the engine to cool down as Dan was passing by. Hot antifreeze sprayed Dan's chest, and he had to go to the emergency room. The ER waiting room was crowded with the assortment of ER visitors seen in most cities: open head wounds, overdoses, withdrawal, and an assortment of injuries and wounds typical of what the ER staff referred to as BRIs, short for beer-related injuries. The seat next to Dan's was empty, and Dan himself looked non-threatening, although he looked like he had been doused with some kind of greenish liquid that gave off a slightly sweet and unpleasant smell at the same time. A tall, attractive brunette jumped up and hobbled over to Dan before plopping down in the empty seat next to him. Since the ER was crowded, they knew they were in for a long wait. They told each other about their injuries. Jake had sprained her ankle while out for a run after work, and they gave each other a rundown of their lives. There was an immediate attraction between Dan and Jake. Dan asked her out to dinner, and she accepted. They hit it off and quickly became a couple. Jake had divorced her first husband for emotional abuse and cheating, and from their first date, she'd told Dan that she wanted a relationship built on trust and honesty. Dan admired her straightforwardness and agreed. They quickly fell in love, and within a year, they were married. Dan felt a renewed sense of hope and purpose with Jake by his side. Despite their busy schedules, they made time for each other, often planning weekend getaways and spontaneous date nights to keep the romance alive. But now, with Jake working late so often, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He trusted her, but the distance between them was growing. He missed their late-night talks and the way she used to light up when she saw him. As he took another sip of bourbon, he thought back to their first date and the spark that had brought them together. Jake's job at the Fortune 500 company was demanding, but Dan knew she was good at what she did. She had a knack for numbers and could balance books with ease. Her colleagues respected her, and her boss often relied on her for critical projects. Dan was proud of her accomplishments, but he couldn't help but wonder if her job was becoming more important than their marriage. Dan's business was thriving, thanks to his hard work and dedication. His chain of auto repair shops had gained a reputation for excellence, and customers came from all over to have their vehicles serviced. He had invested in state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment and tire machinery that could handle even the most exotic wheels. His technicians were some of the best in the industry, thanks to the ongoing training programs Dan had implemented. Despite his professional success, Dan felt a void in his personal life. The cracks in his marriage with Jake were becoming more apparent, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. He needed to talk to her to find out what was really going on. But every time he tried, she seemed distant and preoccupied. He wondered if there was something she wasn't telling him. As he sat in his favorite armchair, bourbon in hand, Dan decided it was time to take action. He couldn't let their marriage fall apart without a fight. He resolved to have a serious conversation with Jake, to lay everything on the table and get to the bottom of what was happening. He wanted to rebuild the connection they once had and ensure their love could withstand the challenges they were facing. With newfound determination, Dan finished his drink and set the glass down. He picked up his iPad and sent Jake a message, asking her to come home early tomorrow so they could talk. He hoped she would understand how important this was to him and agree to the conversation. As he closed his eyes and leaned back, he felt a glimmer of hope. No matter what, he was determined to fight for his marriage and the woman he loved. She had no tolerance for cheaters. They married 15 months after they met. Dan took a sip of his whiskey and thought about his marriage. What was the old joke? We've been happily married for 5 years. Unfortunately, we got married 6 years ago. For the first few years of their marriage, Dan and Jake were ecstatically happy. They laughed together, they danced, they made love all the time. They were good together. The problem started when Jake finished her MBA and was headhunted by the Fortune 500 company she now worked for. Dan was supportive. He wanted Jake to be happy and successful. When one of the senior vice presidents announced his retirement, the senior director Jake reported to was in the running for the position. This left the senior director position vacant, and Jake thought she had a good chance of moving up. She just had to prove that she really wanted the job. After a few months, Dan realized that Jake was becoming curt with him. Nothing he did seemed right anymore. Jake began to disrespect him at work. To her, he was now just a mechanic, a grease monkey. He started to feel the weight of her disdain in every conversation. Her constant anger and irritation with him were a divisive force in their marriage. Jake started working overtime to stay away from Dan. When she was home, she would type messages on her phone, her laughter a secret she kept from him. She would turn the screen away so he couldn't see who she was texting or what the messages were about. She even started sleeping with her phone under her pillow. And then things turned violent. Jake had always had a short temper and was quick to anger. This usually took the form of cutting remarks or stabs at the target of her anger. She had always calmed down quickly and made amends when her temper got the better of her. When Dan was the focus of her anger, her repentance would often translate into a night of good sex. However, Dan had found that her angry outbursts were escalating and lasting longer, but without the makeup sex that, in the past, had made her temper somewhat tolerable. A month ago, during an argument Jake had fabricated for no reason, she slapped him. In more than 6 years of marriage, neither Dan nor Jake had ever raised a hand to each other. The slap had shocked Dan, but it had also shocked Jake, who immediately apologized and asked for forgiveness. But then came the coffee cup incident. A week after the slap, Jake yelled at Dan because his BMW's oil change light had come on and he hadn't changed it. Dan explained to Jake that he had been swamped with work at the shop and hadn't had time to take care of it yet. But Jake didn't want to hear excuses. She picked up a coffee cup and threw it at him. The cup shattered against the wall, narrowly missing Dan's head. The violence in her actions startled Dan, and he realized that their marriage was on a dangerous path. Dan took another sip of his bourbon and tried to make sense of what had happened to them. The woman he had married was not the same person she had become. He missed the days when they laughed together, danced, and made love. He missed the connection they once had. But now that connection was buried under layers of anger, resentment, and mistrust. He knew they needed help, but he wasn't sure if Jake was willing to admit that there was a problem. Every time he tried to talk to her about their issues, she would shut him down or deflect the conversation. It was as if she didn't want to acknowledge the cracks in their marriage. Dan couldn't continue living like this. He loved Jake, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that filled him every time he thought about their future. The bourbon gave him a brief sense of warmth, but it couldn't erase the cold reality of his situation. He needed to confront Jake, to have an honest conversation about their marriage and where it was headed. He needed to know if she was willing to work on their relationship or if it was time to walk away. Dan finished his drink and set the glass down with a determined thud. He picked up his phone and sent Jake a message, asking her to come home early tomorrow so they could talk. He hoped she would understand how important this was to him and agree to the conversation. As he closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, he felt a glimmer of hope. No matter what, he was determined to fight for his marriage and the woman he loved. Her mouth a few times, clearly at a loss for words. Dan, she began, her voice trembling. Dan raised a hand to stop her. Save it, Jake. I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime. He leaned back in his chair, the bourbon warm and comforting in his hand. For the past 6 months, you've been working overtime, but I know better. You've been with him, haven't you? Jake looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Yes, she admitted softly, but it didn't mean anything. It was just a distraction. A distraction? Dan repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Is that what you call betraying your husband? A distraction? Jake's eyes filled with tears again. I never meant to hurt you, Dan. I got caught up in the ambition, the drive to succeed. And Jake, he was there, always there, making me feel wanted. Dan shook his head. And I wasn't there for you? I supported you, Jake, in everything. I wanted you to succeed, to be happy, but you threw it all away for a fling with your boss. Jake tried to reach out to him, but Dan pulled back. Dan, please, we can fix this. We can go to therapy, work through our issues. I love you. Dan looked at her, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. Love? You don't know the meaning of the word. Love is loyalty, trust, and respect. You've shown me none of those things. Jake's tears flowed freely now. Please, Dan, give me another chance. I'll do anything. Dan stood up, setting his glass down with a finality that echoed through the room. It's too late, Jake. I've already filed for divorce. The papers will be served to you tomorrow. He paused, looking at her one last time. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but it won't be with me. With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Jake sobbing on the couch. The bourbon's warmth lingered in his chest, but it did little to soothe the coldness that had settled over his heart. As he stepped outside, the night air felt brisk against his skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth inside. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He knew that this was the right decision, but it didn't make it any less painful. Dan got into his car and drove, not really sure where he was going. He just needed to clear his head to think about what came next. The road stretched out before him, a path to an uncertain future. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He was free now, free to rebuild his life, to find happiness again, and he was determined to do just that. Dan looked at her, his expression calm and unwavering. He set down his glass and met her furious gaze. How dare I? He repeated, his voice low and steady. How dare I? You're angry at me for telling the truth, for exposing the lies and deceit. Jake's face contorted with rage. Yes, you had no right to interfere in their lives. You had no right to hurt those kids. Dan stood up slowly, his height and presence suddenly imposing. And what about my life, Jake? What about the hurt you've caused me? The lies you've told? The trust you've shattered? What about the nights I spent wondering why you were never home? Why you treated me like a stranger? Jake opened her mouth to retort, but Dan held up his hand. Save it. You made your choices. You decided to cheat, to lie, to disrespect everything we built together, and now you have to live with the consequences. I told his wife because she deserved to know the truth, just like I did. Jake's shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to drain out of her. Dan, please, I love you. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can... No, Dan said firmly, cutting her off. It's too late for that. You had your chance to fix things, to come clean. Instead, you continued to lie and deceive. Our marriage is over, Jake. You need to accept that. Tears welled up in Jake's eyes, but Dan felt no sympathy. I gave you everything, he continued. I supported you, believed in you, and you threw it all away for some fling. You don't get to ask for forgiveness now. It's done. Jake sank back onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. What am I going to do? She whispered, her voice muffled. Dan took a deep breath, the finality of his decision settling over him like a weight lifted. You'll figure it out, he said, but you won't do it with me. He picked up his glass and took a final sip, savoring the warmth and burn of the bourbon. I'll be moving out tomorrow. I'll send you the divorce papers soon. Goodbye, Jake. Without waiting for a response, Dan walked to the door, grabbed his keys, and left the house. The night air was cool and refreshing, a stark contrast to the tension inside. As he got into his car and drove away, he felt a strange sense of freedom. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Dan felt hopeful. He had faced the truth, made his decision, and now it was time to move on. He drove through the quiet streets, the city lights blurring into a comforting glow. Dan knew there would be tough days ahead, but he was ready to face them. With every mile, he left a little more of the past behind, looking forward to a future where he could rebuild and find happiness once again. Grabbed her wrists, pushing her away with a controlled force. Enough, he shouted, his voice resonating with authority. Enough, Jake! Jake stumbled back, her chest heaving with rage. You ruined everything. How could you do this to me? She screamed, her face contorted with fury. Dan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wiped the blood from his lips with the back of his hand and stood up, towering over Jake. "I didn't ruin anything. You did that all by yourself the moment you decided to cheat," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "You betrayed me, disrespected our marriage, and now you want to play the victim? No, Jake. This is all on you." Jake's eyes flashed with anger, but there was a hint of desperation in them too. "I made a mistake, Dan. People make mistakes." Dan shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. "A mistake is something you regret and never repeat. You chose to continue your affair, to lie to me every day, to sleep with him in our bed. That's not a mistake, Jake. That's a series of deliberate choices." She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't want this to happen," she sobbed. "I didn't want to lose you." "You lost me the moment you decided to be with him," Dan said, his voice softening just a bit. "I can't forgive you for that, and I can't live with someone I can't trust." The room fell silent, the only sound being Jake's quiet sobs. Dan watched her for a moment, feeling a pang of sadness for what they had lost, for the love that had once been so strong. But he knew that love was gone, replaced by a chasm of betrayal that could never be bridged. He walked over to his chair, picked up his bourbon, and took a long sip. The burn of the alcohol was a welcome distraction from the pain in his heart. "I'll be moving out tomorrow," he said quietly. "You can stay here until we sort everything out, but this marriage is over." Jake looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "Please, Dan, don't do this," she whispered. "We can work it out. We can go to counseling. I'll do anything." Dan shook his head. "It's too late for that. You should have thought about that before you decided to cheat. Goodbye, Jake." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jake sobbing on the floor. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of betrayal was still heavy on his shoulders, but at least now he could begin to move on, to heal, and to rebuild his life without the shadow of infidelity hanging over him. He took another deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. It was time to start anew, to find a life where trust and respect could flourish once more. And he knew, deep down, that he would find that life, one step at a time. Dan covered his face with his arms as she continued to hit him. Jake yelled, "I'm going to take you down, you bastard! I'm going to get a weapon and blow your goddamn head off!" Finally, Dan had had enough. He gently pushed her away as he got up and walked a few steps, placing a two-seater couch between him and Jake. If the 911 operator Dan had called had done his job right, he would only have to wait a couple of minutes for the patrol car to arrive. And that's exactly what happened. Jake stared at Dan with hate-filled eyes. Her chest heaved as she took deep breaths, trying to figure out the best way to go after Dan. To the left? To the right? Over the couch? The doorbell rang before she could devise a plan of attack. "You should probably take it," Dan said, his voice flat and impassive. Jake smiled and squinted as she looked Dan in the eye. She paused for a moment, spun on her heel, and headed for the front door. Jake pushed open the door and was met by two police officers. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and anger as she spoke to the officers, glancing at Dan every few sentences. The officers and Jake were too far away for Dan to make out their conversation, but he could see her gesticulate wildly and point her finger at him. Dan watched as Jake turned away and allowed the officers to enter the house. One officer escorted her out of the living room and into the kitchen. The other officer approached Dan. "Mr. Kenner, I'm Patrolman Diaz, and my partner is Patrolman Agnew. Your wife says you've been violent with her tonight. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Have you touched her?" Dan shook his head. "I confronted my wife about an affair she's having. She attacked me." He pointed to his face, feeling the blood from the cell phone hit and his split lip. "I was the one who called 911. She's been getting violent lately. She slapped me a month ago, and a week later she threw a cup of coffee at my head. She missed, but if she hadn't, I would have ended up in the emergency room. I recorded the confrontation tonight. Would you like to see the video?" Patrolman Diaz nodded, and Dan made several taps on his iPhone before handing it to the officer. Patrolman Diaz watched the video in silence, raising his eyebrows at the scene of Jake throwing herself at Dan. The policeman looked at Dan skeptically. "It sounds like there was a conversation before the recording. Was anything said that might have aggravated the situation? Dan shrugged. She found out I had a private investigator following her for a month and that I had passed the results on to her romantic partner's wife. She wasn't amused. The policeman chuckled. I can see why she might be upset. Dan sighed. I just want this to end. She's been volatile and violent, and I can't live like this anymore. Patrolman Diaz nodded. I understand, Mr. Kenner. We'll need to talk to both of you separately, and then we'll see how to proceed. Dan watched as the officer walked back to the kitchen, where Jake was still speaking animatedly to Patrolman Agnew. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw Jake's face turn red with anger and frustration. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and painful process, but he also knew that it was necessary for his own safety and peace of mind. A few minutes later, Patrolman Diaz returned to Dan. We've decided to remove Jake from the premises for the night. She'll need to stay somewhere else until things cool down and you both have a chance to figure out your next steps. Dan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Thank you, officer. I appreciate it. As Jake was led out of the house, she shot Dan a look of pure hatred. This isn't over, Dan, she hissed. You'll pay for this. Dan didn't respond. He just watched as the officers escorted her to their patrol car and drove away. Once they were gone, he closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. It was over for now, but he knew there would be more challenges ahead. He just hoped he could find the strength to face them. You don't do things by halves, do you? Dan muttered, taking another sip of his bourbon. As that one said, I light my way forward by the light of the fires of the bridges burning behind me. Okay, Dylan McKay, Patrolman Diaz quipped, shaking his head with a bemused smile. His partner emerged from the house, and they conferred quietly. The other officer glanced at Dan, shaking his head before nodding. Patrolman Diaz then played the video from Dan's phone for his partner, who rolled his eyes and sighed heavily. Jake's explanation had been very different, but she was unaware that she had been recorded. Turning back to Dan, Patrolman Diaz said, We're arresting your wife for domestic violence and terroristic threats. My suggestion is that you take out a restraining order. He opened the front door as his partner escorted Jake from the kitchen, her hands cuffed behind her back. She was crying and beginning to hyperventilate. Dan, don't let them do this to me. Please, if you ever loved me, make them let me go. I promise I'll be good. Jake pleaded, her voice breaking. Dan rolled his eyes and turned to the officer, who handed him a business card. My email address is on the card. Send me a copy of the video. As the patrol car drove away, Dan called his attorney, Dwight Solomon. It was exactly as I thought, Dan said into the phone. She was arrested and taken to jail. Stay calm, Dan. If she shows up tomorrow, you know what to do, Dwight replied. The next morning, as Jake was leaving the courthouse accompanied by her parents, she was stopped by a gum-chewing blonde in her 20s. Excuse me, the blonde said, blocking Jake's path. Are you Jake Kenner? Yes, Jake replied, feeling very tired, hungry, and annoyed. Who are you? You're being served, the blonde said, handing an envelope to a surprised Jake. She then turned on her heel and began to walk away, her gums snapping loudly. What is this shit? Jake shouted after her. I don't know, and I don't care, the blonde said over her shoulder as she left. Jake tore open the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a restraining order and divorce papers from Dan. She felt a wave of panic and anger wash over her, and she clenched her fists tightly. Her parents, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. Jake, maybe it's time to face the reality of the situation, her mother said gently. Her father added, You need to get your life together. This is serious. Jake felt the weight of their words, and a sob escaped her lips. She realized that she had lost control of everything she once held dear. Now, she had to face the consequences of her actions, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. As she stood there in the courthouse steps, the gravity of her situation hit her hard. She had to find a way to navigate through this mess and rebuild her life. But for now, all she could do was face the fallout of her choices. But I'd say you're probably screwed, whatever it is. Jake angrily opened the paper and saw the words, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. That son of a bitch, she shouted to her parents. It had been a difficult morning. Jake had been awakened early and taken out of her cell before being transferred to a holding cell in another part of the building. She spent an hour there before meeting with her lawyer. The night before, she had been allowed to make one phone call and used it to call her parents. They had immediately started leaving voicemails at various law firms, hoping to find representation for her as soon as possible. The first lawyer to return their call was hired, assuring them that Jake would be represented at the hearing. The judge set Jake's bail at $10,000, meaning she would have to deposit the full amount or pay a bondsman 10% and pledge real estate as collateral. The judge also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting her husband or showing up at his home. Her parents were waiting for her in the lobby when she was finally released. Their faces were etched with worry and fatigue. They had been up all night, anxious and fearful about what might happen to their daughter. "Jake, what happened?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake," Jake admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know how it all went so wrong." Her father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out. Let's get you home first." They walked her to the car, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. Jake felt a mix of anger, shame, and despair. She couldn't believe how quickly her life had unraveled. As they drove home, her mother spoke softly. "Jake, you need to think about what you're going to do next. This is serious. You need to get your life back on track." Jake nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, Mom. I know." When they arrived at her parents' house, they sat around the kitchen table, discussing the next steps. Her lawyer had already outlined what needed to be done, but the emotional toll was immense. "I'm so sorry," Jake said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "We know, sweetheart," her father said gently, "but now you have to deal with the consequences and make things right." As Jake sat there, surrounded by the love and support of her parents, she realized that the road ahead would be long and difficult. She had lost Dan, and with him, a significant part of her life. Now, she had to find a way to move forward and rebuild her life from the shattered pieces. The days that followed were filled with meetings with her lawyer, court appearances, and the painful process of dividing their assets. Jake moved back into her parents' house, trying to find solace in their familiar presence. But every night, as she lay in bed, the memories of her life with Dan haunted her, reminding her of what she had lost. Meanwhile, Dan was doing his best to move on. He threw himself into his work, expanding his business and finding new opportunities. But even as he succeeded professionally, there was an emptiness inside him that he couldn't ignore. The betrayal had cut deep, and healing would take time. As the weeks turned into months, both Dan and Jake began to find their footing again. Jake started therapy, working through her issues and trying to understand why she had made the choices she did. Dan focused on building a future that no longer included Jake, though the scars remained. In the end, they both learned that life goes on, even after the most painful of experiences. They would never be the same, but they had the chance to grow, to learn, and to find happiness again in their own ways. Sure, here's an extended and more engaging version of the passage. Jake was supposed to arrange with her attorney to retrieve her belongings from her residence or workplace. Jake's attorney initially objected to this arrangement, but quickly withdrew the objection after being presented with damning photos of Jake's husband. The courtroom's tension dissolved as they left, and Jake's parents decided to lift her spirits with a visit to McDonald's. Jake eagerly accepted this plan. She had been booked into the Denton County Jail too late for dinner and had missed breakfast due to an early court appearance. Hungry and exhausted, she couldn't wait to get something to eat. The night before, Jake hadn't had dinner either, choosing instead to spend her time in bed with her boss, Tony. They had shared a passionate night, their second intimate session abruptly interrupted by an alert on Jake's phone. As Tony drifted into sleep beside her, Jake groggily reached for her phone, expecting a message from Dan. Instead, her heart sank as she read a low-balance alert from her bank. With a mix of anxiety and confusion, she quickly logged into her bank's app, discovering that their joint account had only a few dollars left. Panic set in as she saw two substantial ACH withdrawals made that same afternoon, one for $12,000 and another for $18,000. A frantic Google search of the payees' names yielded no results, leaving Jake in a state of dread. She realized they might have been scammed, or that the bank had made a grievous error. Her mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, deceit, and the ominous feeling that her world was beginning to unravel. Jake was a smart woman, sharp and perceptive. She knew the situation with the bank account could mean that Dan, her husband, was aware of her affair and had taken the drastic step of emptying their checking account. But deep down, she didn't think that was the case. She knew Dan well enough to understand that he wasn't one to shy away from confrontation. If he had even a hint of her infidelity, he would have confronted her directly. Dan Kenner was not the kind of man to let such matters slide. Yet here she was, lying next to her boss in a cheap motel room after a spectacular night of passion driven by his mediocrity. It wasn't the first time she found herself questioning her choices, wondering how she ended up here. Life had always been relatively easy for Jake. She had always been the prettiest and smartest in her class, though not the most popular, as the other girls didn't trust her. From a young age, Jake had learned to wield her sexuality as a weapon and wasn't afraid to use it. She started with Mr. Campbell, her high school calculus teacher. A few strategic blowjobs earned her an A+. Letting Mrs. Donovan pleasure her secured an A in economics. Jake never dated high school boys. She was only interested in men, boys who had graduated from college and secured good jobs. College was merely a repeat of high school. If she struggled with her lessons, she seduced her professors. Both men and women alike, everyone wanted a piece of Jake. She graduated with a degree in finance within 4 years. Law school had crossed her mind, but she knew she wasn't academically inclined enough. After all, you couldn't sleep your way to success in law school. Her ongoing affair with Tony Geyer, the senior manager she reported to at Chase Bank, meant nothing to her. It was simply a means to an end. If she could enjoy a bit of recreational sex, as one former lover called it, while securing a promotion, so much the better. It was during her second year at Chase Bank that she met Alina Evans. Alina had visited her branch as part of an investigation into possible money laundering activities by a suspected drug dealer. Working with the Special Operations Division of the Denton County Sheriff's Department, Alina's long hair, mustache, and devil-may-care attitude immediately captivated her. Without hesitation, she invited him out for drinks and ended up in bed with him on their first date. For Jake, the sex was electrifying, and she quickly became infatuated with Alina. Within 2 months, they were living together, and a year later, they were married. Marriage to Alina was a revelation for Jake. She adored him and wanted to do everything to please him, whether domestically or sexually. They were perfect together until they weren't. 4 years into their marriage, they were actively trying to conceive, but hadn't had any luck yet. Nonetheless, they relished the effort. Midway through their 4th year, Alina was offered a chance to attend a 4-week course by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Though it meant he'd be gone for a month, the ATF course would significantly boost Alina's prospects for promotion. It was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. During the first week of Alina's absence, Jake felt lonely but managed well. The second week was tougher, as her hormones and loneliness combined, amplifying her desires. By the end of the 3rd week, she was desperate, resorting to masturbating twice a day to cope. In the 4th week, she agreed to have drinks with Bill Williams, known as Bill Square, a former partner of Alina's at the Sheriff's Department. She wasn't entirely sure what had caused their falling out, but they were no longer friends. She accepted Bill's invitation with the vague notion that it might help mend the rift. Besides, he was attractive and she was lonely. What harm could it do? Meanwhile, Alina was excelling in the ATF class, leading the standings. This was crucial because the top-ranking participant could take the final exam 3 days early. If he passed, he could leave early. If he failed, he had to stay for the remainder of the course. Alina aced the test and was on a plane back to DFW within hours, eager to surprise his wife. At 4 in the morning, an Uber dropped him off in front of his darkened house. He immediately recognized Square's car in the driveway. A cold dread gripped Alina's heart as he opened the front door and stepped into the home he shared with Jake. Jake, he quietly set the suitcase by the front door and stealthily made his way toward the bedroom. The room was dimly lit, with a soft glow emanating from the master bathroom. There lay Square, on his back, completely uncovered. His cock was crusted with Jake's juices, exposed to the air. Jake, lying on her side, faced him with her arm draped across his chest in the same way she used to sleep with her husband. Alina pulled out his phone, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, and began recording the couple as they slept. After about 30 seconds, he took several pictures before putting his phone away. With quiet determination, Alina walked over to Square's side of the bed, his side of the bed until tonight. He clasped his hands together, interlocking his fingers, then raised both hands high above his head. Summoning all his strength, he brought his joined fists down onto Square's penis. The blood-curdling scream that tore from Square's throat jolted Jake from her dreamless, orgasm-induced sleep. She awoke startled and disoriented, seeing Bill writhing in agony and clutching his groin with both hands. When she saw her husband standing over them, her mind struggled to comprehend the scene before her. Then, everything clicked into place. Jake's face contorted with terror as she locked eyes with Alina. His face was a mask of fury, his skin flushed red with anger. "I'll be back at 3 to pick up my stuff. I'll be done by 6. Don't be here during that time. I won't be responsible for my actions if I see you, and you don't deserve to go to jail or for me to lose my job," he spat out, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He grabbed Square by the hair and yanked his head up, forcing him to meet his gaze. "You sorry piece of shit. I'm going to send a copy of the video to your wife in HR. You better go and resign today because your career is over and so is your marriage." Alina delivered a final punch to Square's nose, not hard enough to break it, but forceful enough to make him vomit blood. Then he spun on his heels and left the house, leaving Jake and Square in stunned silence. Jake sighed deeply as she recalled the anguish she had caused Alina with her infidelity. Her once robust and confident husband had been reduced to a broken man, and she feared he would never recover. He had cut off all contact, refusing to see or speak to her. The divorce was swift, with her parents rallying around her, insisting it wasn't her fault. They even went so far as to suggest that Alina's violent tendencies would have doomed their marriage eventually. In their retelling, Jake became the victim of neglect and abuse, a narrative that painted her as the brave woman who did what she had to do to escape a brutish husband. This version of events became her new reality, and Jake embraced the role of a heroine who overcame adversity. Only once was her carefully constructed fiction challenged. She was shopping at Angstrom's in Dallas when she unexpectedly ran into Alina. He was accompanied by a tall, athletic woman with striking red hair who was pushing a stroller. Jake's eyes widened in shock at the sight of her ex-husband for the first time in 5 years. "Hi, Alina," she managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, Jake," he replied, his tone measured and calm. He extended his hand toward the woman beside him. "This is my wife," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Hi, I'm Jake. I used to be married to Alina," she introduced herself, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, I've heard a lot about you," the woman replied, shaking Jake's hand with a knowing smile. Jake blushed at hearing that. Surely nothing good. "Some good, some not so good," the woman replied with a knowing smile. "I'm Corey Calloway. I'm Alina's wife. This is our son, Alina Jr." Corey gestured to the sleeping baby in the stroller. Jake looked down at the serene face of the baby. The hardest thing she had ever done in her life was to keep smiling as she faced her ex-husband's new family. "He's a beautiful baby. You're a lucky woman to be married to Alina. He's a good man. It was good to see you again, Alina." Her voice was steady, but her heart was breaking. Alina merely glared at her, his eyes cold and unforgiving, as he took Corey by the hand and led her toward the men's room, pushing the stroller along. A few days later, Jake was watching the evening news and was shocked to see the anchorwoman was the same woman she had seen with Alina. That's why she had looked familiar. Jake immediately Googled Corey Calloway and discovered that she was an up-and-coming media talent, likely to end up on a national cable news channel. Local media observers noted that while she was pretty enough, though perhaps not vapid enough for Fox News, her intelligence made her a better fit for MSNBC, albeit she would need to develop a more condescending tone for that network. At the moment, she was immensely popular on local news. Jake cried herself to sleep that night and every night for the next week. Each sob brought back memories of her lost life, but eventually she forced herself to remember the fiction she had created. Alina was violent and emotionally abusive, wasn't he? It was only a matter of time before his new marriage ended in disaster as well. This thought brought her some cold comfort as she forced herself back to the present, contemplating what divorce would mean for her future. After eating her Egg McMuffin, Jake insisted her parents take her home. "It's not a good idea, honey," her father cautioned. "I need to talk to Dan. I need to explain what happened. We can work this out," Jake insisted, her voice laced with desperation. "Jake," her mother began, "I don't think it's a good idea." "I don't care what the judge said," Jake snapped, dismissing her mother's concerns. "Just take me home." Her parents reluctantly walked her to her front door and stood by as she rang the doorbell. They waited for a couple of minutes, then Jake rang the doorbell again. When nothing happened, she started pounding on the door. Dan made a quick phone call before opening the front door, keeping the security chain in place. "You're not supposed to be here. There's a restraining order keeping you away," Dan said, his voice calm but firm. "I live here," Jake argued. "How can we fix our marriage if I'm not here?" Dan looked at Jake with disbelief. "Fixing? I'm divorcing you. We're not fixing anything. I'm not staying married to a lying, abusive cheater. You need to get out of here." Dan closed the door, which infuriated Jake. She began pounding on the door with both fists. "Let me in, you cowardly son of a bitch. You've never seen abuse until you see what I'm going to do to your cowardly ass. Open the door, right now." Jake's screams echoed through the quiet neighborhood as she continued to hammer on the door, her rage and despair consuming her entirely. He began pounding frantically on the door, his fists landing with increasing desperation. Seeing their daughter's distress, Jake's parents joined in, their fists echoing against the wooden door. As Jake's agitation grew, their pleas to Dan became louder and more emotional. "Open the door, Dan, or I swear to God I'll kill you. I'll rip your heart out with a steak knife," Jake screamed, her voice raw with fury. "Open the goddamn door, you grease monkey," Jake's father bellowed, his voice shaking with rage. "I'll put you down, boy." Inside, Dan took a calm sip of his coffee, shaking his head as he watched the scene unfold on the doorbell camera. He remained composed, knowing the law was on his side. He continued to watch as a patrol car pulled into the driveway and two officers approached the porch. They spoke with the agitated family for a moment before one officer stepped forward and rang the doorbell. Dan opened the door and invited the officer inside. After verifying Dan's identification, the officer took note of the cuts and bruises on his face. "Last night, I confronted my wife about an affair she is having. I have proof of the affair because I hired a private investigator. She became violent during the confrontation and attacked me," Dan explained, pointing to the marks on his face. "She was arrested last night and appeared in court this morning. She was issued a restraining order prohibiting her from entering this residence." Dan handed the officer a copy of the restraining order that his attorney had emailed to him. "I have this too," he added, showing his phone to the officer and hitting play. The video captured Jake and her parents banging on the door and making threats. The officer shook his head as he watched the footage. "Well, this looks pretty straightforward. Send me a copy of the video," the officer said, handing Dan a business card. He then tapped his shoulder mic and requested 2 more patrol cars for backup. "Stay inside and watch the situation unfold from your phone. Don't leave the house until I give you the all clear." And that's how it happened. The officers consulted with each other while reviewing the video on the phone. They then approached Jake and her parents, informing them that they were all being arrested for trespassing and making terroristic threats. Additionally, Jake was being arrested for violating the restraining order. As 2 more patrol cars arrived, the officers began the process of arresting Jake and her parents. Jake's mother became hysterical, wailing uncontrollably, while Jake herself started crying and cursing at the officers. Her father, in a desperate attempt to reach his wife, tried to push the officers away but was swiftly knocked to the ground. "Shit show" was an understatement. Dan phoned his lawyer and left a brief, exasperated message. "Jake and her parents just got arrested. I think I married into a family of idiots." Leroy Keyes felt utterly defeated as he, his wife, and daughter were all taken into custody on a Friday night for breaking and entering and threatening their son-in-law. Because they had been arrested over the weekend, they spent the entire time in jail, waiting for their court appearance on Monday morning. Restraining orders were issued against Leroy and his wife, barring them from Dan's home and business. Jake's bond was revoked, ensuring she would remain in jail for violating the restraining order. The weekend in jail was long and humiliating. By Monday morning, the weight of their actions and the reality of their situation settled in heavily on the Keyes family. As they stood before the judge, the gravity of their situation became even more apparent, and the consequences of their impulsive, desperate actions began to unfold. Protective order and making terroristic threats against Dan. Leroy and his wife Sarah were able to make bail, but Jake would remain in jail for the foreseeable future. Deep down, he knew he had failed as a father in raising Jake. She was spoiled, entitled, and probably narcissistic, but she was also his little girl. His wife had spent the weekend sharing a cell with Jake. Sarah hadn't wanted to talk about what they'd discussed, but when she was released, she seemed angry and determined. About what, Leroy had no idea. Leroy called the attorney who had handled Jake's first arrest. After explaining the situation, the lawyer, though sympathetic, told him he was going on vacation and wouldn't be available. This was true, but also a convenient excuse, as the attorney felt the whole family was trouble and wanted nothing to do with them. Leroy scoured the yellow pages for another lawyer until he found one who could help immediately. If Leroy had known anything about lawyers, it would have been the first red flag. Raleigh Cruz was not anyone's idea of a reputable lawyer. Skinny, balding, with an aquiline nose and small, narrow eyes, Raleigh bore a striking resemblance to a vulture, perched and waiting for its next meal. A phrase from a long-forgotten literature class popped into Leroy's head, something about a thin, hungry stare. While some ambulance chasers advertised on television and billboards, others took to bus stop benches. Raleigh Cruz seemed to prefer massage parlors and late-night Fox News spots. When Raleigh arrived, he was 20 minutes into lounging in the small waiting room before anyone came to fetch him. The person who finally did was a young woman who barely looked out of high school. Lauren Davis was actually 32 years old and a Yale law graduate. Some might attribute her rapid ascent to her father, Lawrence Davis, a named partner at the firm, but that would be wrong. Her sharp intellect and natural affinity for the law had earned her a junior partnership before she turned 30. Raleigh, unaware of any of this, dismissed her at first sight. Raleigh was taken aback when he saw Lauren sitting across from him in the conference room. Her amused look turned wolfish as he listed his client's requirements. "We have recordings of your daughter attacking her husband. We have recordings of her violating the restraining order and making death threats. We also have recordings of you and your wife making threats. And there's a prenuptial agreement, which you conveniently forgot to mention," Lauren said, her tone icy and precise. Raleigh felt the sting of inadequacy. "You've made me sound like a first-year law student instead of someone who has been practicing law for 30 years, he said bitterly. The entire affair had been a disaster. He felt like a fool, and the Keyes family's antics had only compounded his frustration. He realized that this was going to be an uphill battle, one that would test every ounce of his legal acumen. As he stared at the evidence piled against them, he knew he had his work cut out for him. The stakes were high, and the Keyes family's future hung precariously in the balance. Humiliating experience for Raleigh, and he was pissed off. "I dismiss you as clients. Find someone else to take care of your bullshit. Oh, and here's my bill for the time you've wasted. Now get the hell out of my office." Jake and her parents sat across the conference room table from Dan. Jake had dressed to the nines, knowing she looked good. She wanted her husband to see what he was losing. Dan watched her in amused silence, oblivious to her attempts to make him regret his decision to divorce her. They had agreed on all the points of the divorce. There was not much to divide. They would each keep what they had brought into the marriage. Dan had bought the house during his first marriage and would keep the property, as Jake had never been listed on the deed. She felt that Dan had never been fully committed to their marriage. Dan saw it as his subconscious not fully trusting Jake. In the end, they were both right. As part of the divorce settlement, Dan demanded that Jake return her wedding set, and he would return her engagement ring. She had put her rings in an envelope and passed it across the conference room to Dan. He didn't have an envelope, so he had taken the ring off his finger and slid it across the table to Jake, where it remained throughout the meeting. As they stood, finished with the task that brought them together for the last time, Dan had a question for Jake. "Can you tell me why? You had a good life. I know you loved me, and I loved you. Why would you throw it all away for an affair?" Jake sighed and looked up for a moment before meeting Dan's gaze. "I don't know. Boredom, restlessness, increasing my chances for promotion, maybe a little of all three. What do you want me to say, Dan? Do I regret cheating on you? I regret getting caught. I can't say I regret the affair or the sex. That's just me. But you were a good husband. I wasn't a good wife. I don't know if I'll ever be a good wife. To anyone." Dan nodded, her words confirming what he had already known or suspected. Jake picked up her personal papers and turned to leave. "Jake?" She turned to look at Dan, who pointed to her wedding ring still on the conference table. "You should probably take it." Author's notes. The story of Alina Evans and Corey Calloway has yet to be told. I'm pretty sure William Bill Squared Williams will appear in their story, and things probably won't go well for him. This revised passage adds more depth and detail to the characters' emotions and actions, making the narrative more engaging while keeping the original dialogue intact.